The cry didn't sound like anything Ethan Parker had ever heard before. It cut through the stillness of Glacier National Park like a blade high-pitched at first, then breaking into a low whimper that echoed across the valley floor. The patrol team stopped in their tracks. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere out there in the maze of pine and aspen, a young grizzly bear cub was calling for his mother. But no reply came. It was late September, a time when most grizzly bear families would already be gorging on berries and salmon runs before the heavy Montana snows arrived. Rangers had been tracking a female grizzly in the area for weeks, concerned about her limping gait and the unusual pattern of her movements. That night they followed fresh tracks, pressed deep into the damp soil, paw prints much larger than any cub could leave. The trail ended abruptly near a ridge scattered with torn branches and clumps of fur. A fight had taken place here. Grizzlies sometimes clash over territory, food, or simply the wrong encounter at the wrong time. The ground told the story of violence. The cub's cry told the story of what came after. Ethan knelt, flashlight beams sweeping across the brush. And there he was, a tiny ball of fur no bigger than a house cat, trembling in the cold. His eyes reflected the light like amber glass, wide with terror. He pressed himself into the roots of a fallen tree, as if hoping the earth itself could swallow him up and hide him. Ethan extended a gloved hand, speaking softly, though he knew the cub didn't understand words. The little grizzly let out a hoarse chuff, then staggered forward on shaky legs toward the very humans he should have feared. The team carried him carefully into their truck. His ribs were visible under his fur. Without his mother's milk and protection, the cub's chances were almost zero. Rangers often witness such tragedies and can only record them because intervening goes against the principle of letting the wild stay wild. But this case was different. Glacier National Park is home to fewer than 1,000 grizzly bears, a population under constant threat from shrinking habitat vehicle collisions and conflicts with humans. Every cub matters. And this one, abandoned yet fighting to stand, was refusing to give up. Back at the ranger station, the cub received fluids from the park's on-call veterinarian, Dr. Caroline Hayes. She checked his temperature, listened to his faint heartbeat, and shook her head. "He's critical," she said quietly. "Without constant care, he won't see sunrise." Ethan stayed by the cage, unable to step away. The cub's cries had softened, replaced by small jerks of his head, as if searching for a heartbeat he could no longer find. For Ethan, a young biologist, barely a year into his posting at Glacier, it was impossible to detach. He had joined the park service to protect grizzly bears in the wild, not to watch one fade before his eyes. At moments like this, the rules of conservation clash with the weight of compassion. Park policy urged minimal human contact, but in rare cases, exceptions are made when the survival of the species is at stake. After tense phone calls with state officials and a senior supervisor, permission was granted for emergency fostering. Someone would need to take the cub, home feed him, and give him round-the-clock care until a longer-term solution could be found. Ethan volunteered before the words had even left the superintendent's mouth. He didn't think about logistics, his small cabin with its creaky floorboards, his long work shifts, or the reality of raising a predator. He only thought about the way the cub's amber eyes had locked onto his flashlight beam. There was a plea in them, silent but unmistakable. "Don't leave me here." That first night, Ethan drove back to his cabin with the cub bundled in an old wool blanket. The forest loomed on either side of the road, branches scraping against the truck like whispers. Each bump made the cub stir, emitting soft, breathy whines. At one point, Ethan reached over instinctively, and the cub pressed his damp nose against Ethan's sleeve before curling tighter into the blanket. It wasn't fear anymore, it was trust, misplaced or not. In the cabin, Ethan set up a heated box lined with towels and placed the cub inside. He rummaged through emergency supplies, powdered formula designed for carnivore rescues, a set of bottles with rubber nipples and antiseptic wipes. His hands shook as he prepared the first bottle. Would the cub even drink? Survival hinged on this single moment. Ethan cradled the tiny creature and pressed the bottle gently to its mouth. For a long second, nothing happened. Then, with surprising force, the cub latched on, pulling at the milk like his life depended on it, because it did. Ethan exhaled for what felt like the first time all night. The hours that followed blurred into a rhythm of feeding, cleaning, and listening. The cub whimpered whenever Ethan stepped away, so he stayed close, sitting cross-legged on the floor as the fire crackled weakly in the stove. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, filled with the distant calls of owls and the rustle of unseen animals. Inside, in the circle of firelight, a fragile heartbeat grew steadier. This was more than rescue, it was the forging of a bond. And bonds have consequences. Scientists often warn against anthropomorphizing wildlife. A grizzly bear is not a pet, not a child. Yet in moments of desperation, survival sometimes requires stepping across lines. Ethan knew that every hour spent with the cub risked imprinting, making it harder to reintegrate him with wild bears later. But he also knew that leaving him to die meant surrendering a chance at life for one of America's most iconic animals. It was a decision weighted with both hope and risk. Boone after the explorer, Daniel Boone, who once roamed the wild frontiers of North America. Ethan whispered it as he fed him at dawn, and the cub's ears twitched as if recognizing something familiar. Names have power. Boone was no longer just a statistic in a report. He was a story unfolding one bottle at a time. Looking back, Ethan often admitted he hadn't been prepared for the emotional toll. There were doubts. Was he interfering too much? Would Boone survive only to live half a life, torn between two worlds? Would he grow strong enough to resent the human who had saved him? In those early days, questions outweighed answers. Yet every time Boone's small paw curled around his finger, gripping with surprising strength, the doubts softened. Sometimes survival is not about perfect solutions, but about refusing to give up in the darkest hour. That night in Glacier National Park offered more than a rescue. It offered a perspective. Wild animals are not statistics on a chart. They are beating hearts, each with the right to fight for life. It reminded Ethan, and later everyone who heard Boone's story, that conservation isn't abstract. It happens one animal at a time, in moments when humans must decide whether to step back or step closer. Compassion can coexist with science, and sometimes it must. Boone's first cries were cries of despair. But by the end of that night, they had become something else, the fragile sound of hope. Ethan didn't yet know the price of that hope. He didn't know the sleepless weeks ahead, the sacrifices, the blurred line between raising a cub and raising a child. But as dawn broke over Glacier's mountains, painting the peaks in pale gold, Boone lay sleeping with milk on his whiskers, safe for the first time since his birth. This was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Ethan Parker never imagined that his living room would one day resemble a nursery for a grizzly bear cub. Yet, that's exactly what it became. Boone, fragile and hungry, turned every hour of Ethan's life upside down. The small cabin near the edge of Glacier National Park was built for solitude. Not bottle warmers and feeding alarms, but within days it became a world where science, compassion, and survival collided. At first, the logistics seemed impossible. Grizzly bear cubs in the wild nurse from their mothers for nearly a year. Without that bond, Boone needed a substitute. Ethan prepared a specialized carnivore milk formula, carefully measuring it down to the milliliter. Every 2 hours around the clock, he fed Boone from a bottle. Each feeding was a test. Would the cub drink? Would his body accept it, or would rejection set him back? Boone latched on with surprising strength, draining every drop, as though instinct told him this was his only chance. The nights were hardest. At midnight, at 2 at 4, Ethan rose from his chair to the sound of Boone's cries. He held the cub against his chest, rocking gently as if soothing a human infant. Boone's paws pressed into his shirt claws, still too small to break the skin but strong enough to cling. Sometimes he whimpered even after finishing the bottle, curling into Ethan's arm until exhaustion overtook him. Sleep for Ethan came in fragments, 10 minutes here, 20 minutes there, but he didn't complain. Every time he looked up at me, I forgot how tired I was, Ethan later admitted. It wasn't only exhaustion he faced. Behind the warmth of those moments lurked heavier questions. Raising a predator in a human home meant walking a narrow path between compassion and risk. Federal law required a series of permits, inspections, and justifications. Each document reminded Ethan of the reality Boone was not a pet. He was a wild animal with instincts that no amount of bottle feeding could erase. Park administrators debated whether Boone should have been left in the wild to perish. One supervisor argued bluntly, "We may be saving him only to create a bear that doesn't belong anywhere." Ethan heard the words, but when Boone looked at him with those amber eyes, doubt melted. The choice had already been made. As weeks passed, Boone grew stronger. His eyes brightened, his coat thickened, and he began exploring the cabin. He sniffed furniture legs, batted at shoes, and once tried to climb onto the kitchen counter to investigate a pan of trout. Ethan quickly learned to bear-proof his own home latches on cupboards, reinforced trash bins, doors closed at all times. What might have been funny in another context carried real weight here. A grizzly cub's curiosity was more than mischief. It was the rehearsal of instincts that in time could make him dangerous even to the one who saved him. Still, the bond deepened. Boone developed an unusual attachment to an old red-checkered flannel shirt Ethan once left on the floor. The cub dragged it everywhere, chewing the sleeves, curling into it when afraid. One stormy night when thunder rattled the windows, Boone whined until Ethan placed the shirt over his small body. Only then did he settle. Ethan realized that for Boone, the shirt had become more than fabric. It was a stand-in for the mother he had lost. It gave him comfort, a sense of security. That image of a wild predator clinging to a human object captured the strangeness and fragility of their situation. Friends and colleagues worried. They saw the toll on Ethan's health, the dark circles under his eyes, the isolation. They warned that Boone would soon outgrow his bottle-fed innocence. One ranger recounted a case in Wyoming where a hand-raised cub, once docile, attacked its caretaker without warning. The warning hung in the air like a shadow. But Ethan chose to see another perspective. Every day, Boone's survival proved that intervention wasn't just sentiment, it was science in action. He documented Boone's feeding schedules, sleep cycles, and responses to stimuli, creating a record that could later inform wildlife rehabilitation practices. What began as a rescue was also turning into research, a bridge between compassion and conservation. There were moments of joy that made the risks fade into the background. Boone's first wobbly steps across the cabin floor, his delighted chuff when Ethan returned from work, his awkward attempt to climb onto the couch, sliding back down, but trying again until he succeeded. Each milestone carried a lesson. Survival is built on persistence, not perfection. Boone didn't give up when he fell. He tried again, and in doing so, he taught Ethan that resilience is often a matter of stubborn courage. Outside the cabin, the Montana wilderness carried on unchanged. Snow dusted the peaks. Elk bugled in the valleys, and wolves howled at night. Boone would pause sometimes, ears pricked toward the sounds of his kin. But then he returned to Ethan's side, torn between the world of the wild and the world of humans. That tension between belonging and not belonging would only grow sharper as Boone grew older. Raising a predator in a human home is not a fairy tale. It is a delicate dance between love and realism, a balancing act where every decision has consequences. It is tempting to see Boone as a cute animal video, another clip in the endless stream of animal stories online. But behind the charm lies complexity. Legal battles, emotional strain, and the ever-present knowledge that Boone could never fully return to the life nature intended for him. Yet there was something profound in those early months. Boone's survival wasn't only about biology, it was about connection. A young biologist in Montana and a grizzly cub abandoned in the forest found each other by chance, and in that meeting both lives changed. Boone learned to trust when every instinct told him not to. Ethan learned that conservation is not only about protecting landscapes, it is also about the quiet, relentless work of saving one life at a time. As winter deepened and Boone's body grew heavier in Ethan's arms, the mystery lingered. How long could this fragile arrangement last? A grizzly bear cub raised like a human baby was a story unlike any other. But stories have turning points, and Boone's was coming sooner than Ethan expected. Boone's childhood unfolded in ways both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because his days revolved around games, curiosity, and the small victories of growing up. Extraordinary because he was a grizzly bear cub, learning all of this inside the cabin of a young biologist instead of the rugged valleys of Montana. Every moment carried both joy and unease, love and risk, laughter and the reminder of claws waiting just beneath the softness of fur. By the time Boone reached 3 months, the bottle feedings had given way to ground meat mixed with formula. Ethan placed the bowl on the floor and Boone would dive in with gusto, his small, muzzle-stained pink paws holding the dish steady, like a child clutching cereal. Ethan laughed the first time Boone tried to drag the bowl under the table, protective of his meal in a way only wild animals understand. Food to Boone was more than nutrition, it was survival. That instinct, hardwired by generations of grizzly bears, surfaced even in the safety of a cabin. Soon, Boone turned feeding time into playtime. He pawed at Ethan's boots, nipped at his pant leg, and rolled across the floor as if daring his caretaker to join in the game. What started as innocent fun revealed a truth: Boone was strong, stronger than Ethan realized. A playful swipe that left only a scratch now would one day carry the weight of a predator capable of toppling an elk. The lesson came quickly. Games with Boone required boundaries. Ethan learned to redirect his energy with safe toys, thick ropes knotted at the ends, wooden blocks, even recycled tires. Boone gnawed, tugged and wrestled, burning his strength without placing Ethan in danger. The red-checkered flannel shirt never left Boone's side. What began as an accidental discovery turned into his comfort object. Boone dragged it to his sleeping box, curled against it during thunderstorms, and chewed on the sleeves when anxious. Sometimes, when Ethan left for a shift at the park, Boone paced until the shirt was placed near him. Only then would he settle. Behavioral experts later explained that wild animals raised by humans sometimes transfer lost maternal bonds onto objects. For Boone, the shirt was not just fabric, it was memory, security, and home. Ethan realized he couldn't take it away without taking away Boone's peace. This peculiar attachment sparked debates among colleagues. Some said allowing the shirt blurred the line further between Boone's wild nature and human imprinting. Others argued it was necessary for his emotional stability. Ethan listened to both sides but chose to see the shirt differently, not as proof Boone was less wild, but as proof that wildness and vulnerability can coexist. Even grizzly bear cubs destined for strength and dominance in the forest need comfort. That perspective changed the way Ethan approached Boone. He wasn't trying to erase Boone's instincts, but to understand how love and instinct intertwined. As Boone's world expanded, so did his games. He stalked Ethan from behind furniture, crouching low with eyes wide, then leaping forward with a growl that was more comical than frightening. He discovered the bathroom mirror and spent hours swatting at the other cubs staring back. He tumbled across rugs, slid on wooden floors, and once in a burst of mischief leaped into the bathtub while Ethan was running water. Boone splashed with glee, sending water across the room, while Ethan, soaked and laughing despite himself, realized boundaries would forever be tested. Yet childhood wasn't only fun. Boone's instincts reminded Ethan daily of the thin line they walked. Grizzly bears in the wild learned to climb trees by watching their mothers. Boone had no such guide. One afternoon, determined, he clawed his way up the bookshelf, scattering field guides and notebooks across the floor. His triumphant chuff at the top was matched only by Ethan's panic, rushing to catch him before he toppled backward. Lessons like these made clear Boone would invent his own wildness even in a cabin. The question wasn't if, it was how. Boone's development was slower than wild cubs. Without siblings to spar with or a mother to discipline him, his coordination lagged. Yet he compensated with resilience. Each failed attempt to balance each tumble from the couch was followed by another try. Ethan recorded these sessions later, showing them to Dr. Caroline Hayes at the park clinic. She watched Boone's persistence and remarked, "He isn't just playing. He's teaching himself survival." Through Boone's games, Ethan also discovered his own lessons. Patience, for one. Boone's energy never ended even when exhaustion wrapped Ethan like a heavy coat. Compassion, too. Boone's dependence reminded him that strength is not about dominance, it's about trust. Most of all, humility. Watching a grizzly cub learn to navigate both a cabin and his instincts, Ethan realized how small human control really is. Nature doesn't vanish when brought indoors. It adapts. It insists it finds ways to surface, even in human spaces. Of course, danger was never far. Boone once sank his tiny teeth into Ethan's sleeve, not in aggression, but in play. Still, the pressure left bruises. Ethan looked at the marks and thought of the future. What would those playful bites become when Boone weighed 200 pounds? This tension between tenderness and fear was the shadow beneath every joyful moment. Boone needed boundaries, not because he lacked affection, but because affection could become dangerous without discipline. Ethan began implementing rituals. Feeding times are at strict hours, play sessions with designated toys. No games that involve chasing hands or biting sleeves. Boone resisted at first, whining, nudging, and trying to break the rules. But over time, he learned. Structure created safety not just for Ethan, but for Boone himself. A bear cub who grew without boundaries would not survive neither in the wild nor in captivity. And yet, amid the discipline, the mystery of Boone's heart endured. He followed Ethan from room to room, sat outside the bathroom door until it opened and curled at the foot of his bed, as if to say, "I will not leave you." The bond between man and grizzly deepened, raising a question conservationists often avoid. Can love itself become a barrier to survival? Ethan didn't have the answer. He only knew that Boone, despite claws and instincts, had chosen him. Wild animals are not blank slates we can mold to our image. They carry the wisdom of their species' instincts sharpened over centuries. Yet they also reveal vulnerability when given care. Boone showed that survival is not just about fangs and forests, it is also about trust, comfort, and the small rituals that anchor life. That's a lesson not only about bears, but about ourselves. By the time Boone reached 6 months, he weighed nearly 80 pounds. His games grew louder, his paw swipes heavier, his playful tackles rougher. Ethan looked at him with pride and worry in equal measure. Boone was no longer just a cub in need of rescue. He was a growing predator with instincts sharpening every day. Childhood was fleeting and adolescence was coming. With it came a new challenge, the danger hidden in innocence. By the time Boone turned 9 months old, Ethan could no longer lift him with ease. The tiny cub who once curled into a flannel shirt now weighed close to 100 pounds. His paws, once the size of Ethan's palm, left prints as wide as dinner plates in the snow outside the cabin. What had once been cute was beginning to shift into something more complicated, and Ethan felt it every day. It started with play. Boone loved to ambush Ethan from behind the couch or crouch low before leaping toward him with a growl that was meant as fun. For months, these games brought laughter. But now, Boone's swipes left scratches. His pounces knocked Ethan off balance, and his nips, though playful, bruised the skin beneath the sleeve. The strength of a young grizzly bear cub was no longer harmless. What looked like affection could in an instant turn into danger. One evening, Boone leaped while Ethan was carrying a pot of stew. The playful lunge sent the pot crashing, broth splattering across the floor. Boone, startled, slipped in the mess and let out a low roar. For the first time, Ethan saw fear flicker in Boone's eyes, not fear of the world, but fear of himself. Ethan crouched down slowly, whispering reassurance, and Boone pressed his head against his caretaker's chest. The danger passed, but the message was clear. Childhood innocence had limits, and they had just reached them. Ethan began to change routines. Games with hands and sleeves were replaced with ropes, logs, and puzzle feeders. Boone's strength needed direction, not suppression. He built obstacles in the yard, hung meat from trees to encourage climbing, and rolled heavy barrels across the floor for Boone to chase. These activities echoed the way grizzly bears in the wild sharpen their hunting skills, turning strength into survival. For Boone, they became new rituals. For Ethan, they were lines of safety. Still, the risk lingered. A neighbor ranger once visited and watched Boone rear up on his hind legs, towering over Ethan, who stood frozen. "That bear doesn't know his own power," the ranger warned. "One mistake could end it all." The words stayed with Ethan through sleepless nights. He loved Boone like family, but love didn't erase reality. Predators remain predators, no matter how many bottles they've drained in your kitchen. The tension grew sharper when Boone accidentally grazed Ethan's cheek with a claw. It wasn't aggression, just a swipe during play. But the thin red line across Ethan's face burned like fire, not from pain, but from realization. He stared at his reflection later, tracing the mark, and whispered to himself, "This is only the beginning." Every choice Ethan made now had weight. He locked doors more carefully, kept tranquilizers on hand, and called Dr. Hayes for advice. She reminded him of cases where human-raised cubs turned unpredictable at adolescence. Some were relocated to sanctuaries, others never survived the transition. Boone's story hung on a thread. Ethan's heart told him to trust Boone. Science told him to prepare for the opposite. Yet Boone himself seemed unaware of the danger. He still dragged the red flannel shirt around, still whined when Ethan left the room, still chuffed with joy when his caretaker returned from patrol. His loyalty never wavered, and that loyalty carried its own mystery. How could an animal destined to roam wild valleys remain so attached to a single human? Boone's innocence was not gone, it had simply grown teeth. The lesson hidden in these months was clear. Affection without boundaries becomes risk. Ethan learned to see Boone's love not as safety, but as responsibility. Boone trusted him completely. That trust required Ethan to anticipate what Boone himself could not, the danger of his own instincts. In caring for Boone, Ethan was not just protecting himself, he was protecting Boone from choices that might cost his life if things went wrong. True love for wildlife is not about taming them, but about respecting their nature, even when it scares us. It is easy to adore wild animals when they are small, cute, and harmless. It is harder when they grow into their power. Boone's story forced Ethan to confront that gap head-on. One winter morning, Ethan watched Boone dig through snow drifts, scattering flakes like a storm. He thought of wild grizzly bears at that same age learning to forage under their mother's watch, discovering which roots could sustain them through hibernation. Boone had no mother to teach him. He had Ethan. That truth carried both hope and danger. Hope because Boone had survived. Danger because his survival depended on a human who could never teach him everything he needed to know. Raising a predator is not a fairy tale. It is a responsibility lined with risks that never vanish, only shift. Boone's claws and teeth grew faster than his understanding. Ethan's task was not to erase those instincts, but to guide them with caution and care. By Boone's first birthday, he weighed nearly 150 pounds. His play was powerful, his presence commanding. Ethan stood by the cabin window one night, watching Boone pace the yard, his breath steaming in the cold air. He realized with a chill that Boone was no longer a cub. He was becoming a bear in every sense of the word. Cute had turned dangerous, and danger demanded new choices. By Boone's first spring, the line between cub and bear had disappeared. His shoulders broadened, his stride lengthened, and his playful growls carried a weight that echoed through the cabin walls. He was no longer the helpless grizzly bear cub Ethan had wrapped in a blanket on that September night. He was something else entirely, caught between the world of humans and the wild he could no longer return to. Ethan first felt the dilemma on a trip back to Glacier National Park. The team had arranged a cautious introduction. Boone would be housed in a secure enclosure beside two wild-born juvenile grizzlies. The hope was simple. If Boone responded to their sounds, if they responded to his, perhaps a bridge could form. Perhaps Boone could reclaim the wildness that had been dulled by months in a cabin. But the meeting was heartbreaking. The other cubs approached the fence, sniffing with curiosity. Boone padded forward, 2 ears alert. For a moment it looked promising. Then the wild cubs bristled, growled low, and backed away. One swiped at the mesh as if Boone were an intruder. The ranger beside Ethan shook his head. "He smells wrong," the ranger muttered. "He smells like us." Ethan watched Boone retreat, pressing close against his leg. The cub, who had once chuffed with joy at the sight of new toys, now trembled at the sound of his own kind. It was the first time Ethan understood fully Boone belonged nowhere. Not in the wilderness, where his scent and behavior marked him as foreign. Not in the human world, where his instincts grew sharper every day. Boone was living in the space between. That night, Ethan replayed the scene in his mind. He thought of wild grizzlies roaming the valleys, teaching their young to dig for roots, to fish for trout, to defend themselves against wolves. Boone had no teacher except him. The question cut deep: was saving Boone really saving him, or was it condemning him to a life of isolation? The park's staff debated the same issue. Hayes reminded Ethan of cases across the United States, human-raised cubs who never integrated, some euthanized when they became too dangerous for facilities to handle. Others lived out their days in sanctuaries, safe but separated from the life nature had intended. "It's the hardest truth of our work," she said. "Sometimes survival isn't the same as belonging." Ethan struggled with the idea. He remembered the first time Boone clung to his sleeve with tiny claws, the first bottle drained, the first playful pounce. Each moment had carried the promise of a future, now that the future seemed blurred. Boone wasn't just a bear, he was a bear who had been raised like a human baby. And that changed everything. One evening, Ethan set Boone's red flannel shirt on the floor and watched as the bear lay on it, curling his massive body around the fabric. It was the same behavior Boone had shown since cubhood, only now his body stretched from one end of the room to the other. Ethan realized the shirt was more than comfortable. It was a symbol of Boone's condition. He carried the smell of humans, the fabric of humans, the touch of humans, to wild grizzlies that made him alien, to humans that made him dangerous. The shirt told the whole story. Compassion saves lives, but it can also create lives that no longer fit. The bond between man and bear had given Boone survival, but it had also placed him on a path where neither world fully welcomed him. It is a dilemma conservationists rarely speak about in public because it does not fit easily into tidy success stories. Yet it is real, and Boone embodied it with every step he took. Still, Ethan sought a fresh perspective. What if Boone's existence, though caught between, could have meaning? What if he could become more than a bear who belonged nowhere? He began imagining possibilities. Boone as an ambassador in a sanctuary, teaching visitors about the fragility of wild populations, inspiring children to care about grizzlies before it was too late. Boone's story could shift from tragedy to purpose. This idea took root when Ethan visited a nearby wildlife rescue center that had housed orphaned black bears. Some cubs never returned to the forest, but they played a vital role in education programs. School groups visited, saw the animals up close, and left with new respect for wildlife. Boone, Ethan thought, could do the same for grizzly bears, symbols of strength, resilience, and now survival against the odds. The community's reaction was mixed. Some locals admired the story of a ranger raising a cub that would have died. Others whispered fears. What if Boone escaped? What if one day he turned on Ethan? The debate reflected the larger question of coexistence. How much should humans interfere in the lives of wild animals? Where is the line between rescue and control? Boone's life forced everyone to confront those questions, whether they wanted to or not. For Ethan, the decision became a personal sacrifice. He sold his car, diverted his savings, and began sketching plans for a transitional home where Boone could live safely but still taste the rhythms of the wild. He imagined climbing trees, digging earth, hearing streams, all within a sanctuary that kept both bear and humans safe. It would not be freedom, but it would not be captivity in the old sense either. It would be something new, a place for those who lived between. Watching Boone play in the yard one spring morning, batting a barrel with his massive paws, Ethan whispered, "You don't have to choose. We'll make a place where both worlds can exist." It was a promise born of love and responsibility, but also of necessity. Boone had shown him that belonging is not always about fitting perfectly. Sometimes it is about creating a space where imperfection itself is accepted. The wild versus captive debate isn't black and white. Boone's story challenges us to rethink what it means to belong. Perhaps belonging is not only about place, but about purpose. Boone might never fish a river with wild kin, but he could stand as a living reminder of what happens when animals and humans collide, sometimes violently, sometimes with unexpected bonds. By the end of that spring, Ethan knew the choice ahead. Boone would not return to Glacier's valleys. He would need a sanctuary of his own, a space carefully built to honor both his instincts and his history. The cub saved from the forest would grow into a bear who lived in the margins, but maybe those margins held a lesson for all of us. Ethan Parker had always imagined his savings would go toward graduate school or maybe a small piece of land near Flathead Lake. Instead, every dollar now pointed toward a single goal: building a sanctuary. Grizzly bear cub, who had outgrown both the cabin and the life that had once seemed possible. Boone needed space. Not a cage, not a zoo exhibit, but a place where his instincts could breathe without betraying the bond that had kept him alive. The idea grew during long nights when Boone paced restlessly across the cabin floor, claws clicking against the wood. He had outgrown every corner. No toy, no rope, no barrel could contain his strength anymore. Watching Boone sit by the window staring at the dark line of mountains in the distance, Ethan realized the cabin was no longer a home, it was a holding cell. If Boone stayed here, frustration would one day erupt into destruction. If Boone returned to the wild, he would not survive. The only path left was one no manual described: create a new world. Ethan sold his car, emptied his small savings, and borrowed what he could. With help from fellow rangers and a few volunteers, he purchased 5 acres of rugged land near the conservation center. It was rough terrain. Scattered pines, a shallow creek, rocky outcrops, but to Ethan it looked like a possibility. Here, Boone could climb, dig, explore, and rest. Here he could test the instincts that still whispered within him. The work began immediately. Volunteers hauled logs to build climbing structures. Old telephone poles were anchored upright as scratching posts. Rocks were cleared to shape sunning spots. Ethan designed the space with 2 sections. One wild, filled with trees and brush, and one home, a simple shelter with familiar smells, an old couch, Boone's red flannel shirt, and shaded corners where he could retreat. The 2 areas connected seamlessly. Boone could choose where to be crossing between the human comfort he trusted and the wilderness he craved. Boone's first visit to the land was uncertain. He stepped from the trailer hesitantly, nose twitching at the unfamiliar scents. The forest was alive with bird calls. The creek gurgled softly, and the wind carried scents no cabin could hold. Yet Boone pressed close to Ethan's side as though the openness was more frightening than comforting. He circled the shelter again and again, pawing at the door as if to ask, "Can't we go back?" For 2 days, Boone barely ate. He paced, growled at shadows, and pressed his body against Ethan whenever they walked the perimeter. A colleague suggested that maybe the move was a mistake. "He doesn't understand this freedom," she said. But Ethan waited. He stayed in the shelter overnight, sleeping on a cot near Boone, wearing the same flannel Boone loved. He whispered to him, reassured him, and fed him by hand. Slowly, Boone calmed. The turning point came one afternoon when Ethan sat reading in the shelter. Boone slipped out quietly. Minutes passed. Then Ethan heard the rustle of branches. He looked up to see Boone high in a pine tree body, moving with a grace Ethan had never witnessed inside the cabin. The cub turned bare, balanced easily, claws digging into bark, eyes shining with something new. For the first time, Boone looked not like a displaced cub, but like a grizzly. Ethan felt tears rise as he whispered, "This was the right choice." From that day, Boone explored with confidence. He dug into the earth along the creek, overturned logs in search of beetles, and stretched on the flat rocks as the sun warmed his fur. At dusk, he returned to the shelter, dragging the flannel shirt to his corner. The pattern became his rhythm, wild by day, familiar by night. This duality held a lesson. Belonging doesn't always mean choosing one side. Boone showed that it can mean walking between 2 worlds, taking what each offers. In his sanctuary, he could be both grizzly and Boone, wild hunter and bottle-raised cub, predator and companion. For Ethan, that realization was profound. He had spent months wrestling with the guilt that Boone didn't belong anywhere. Now he saw it differently. Boone belonged here in the space created for him, where love and instinct didn't cancel each other, but coexisted. The project also carried ripple effects. Local school groups began visiting the site, learning about Boone's journey, about why grizzly bear cubs are sometimes abandoned, and about the challenges of coexistence in Montana. Children pressed their hands to the observation fence wide-eyed as Boone splashed in the creek or shook water from his coat. They asked questions Ethan had wrestled with himself. Why can't he live with the other bears? Does he miss his mom? Each answer became a moment of education. Boone's life was no longer just survival, it was purpose. The financial strain was real. Ethan gave up trips, nights out, even basic comforts. But when he watched Boone climb trees or chase leaves through the sanctuary, the sacrifices faded. What mattered was the proof that resilience, when given space, could flourish. The fresh perspective here is that conservation isn't always about restoring what was lost. Sometimes it's about creating something entirely new. Sanctuaries like Boone's don't erase the tragedy of orphaned cubs, but they turn that tragedy into teaching, into awareness, into a reminder that every life, no matter how complicated, has value. For viewers, Boone's new world carries a lesson we can carry into our own lives. Sometimes belonging isn't found in returning to what was, but in building what has never existed before. Boone could never go back to the valleys of Glacier, but he could thrive in a space born of human devotion and wild memory. By the end of summer, Boone had claimed the sanctuary as his own. He had favorite spots: a rock that caught the first light of dawn, a pine tree he marked with deep claw scratches, a shaded corner of the shelter where the red flannel always lay. Ethan knew Boone still needed him, but less than before. Independence, however imperfect, was growing. Boone was still alone. The sanctuary gave him trees to climb, water to splash in, and rocks to stretch across, but it couldn't give him what every grizzly bear cub eventually seeks: a bond with his own kind. No matter how strong their connection was, Ethan was human. Boone needed a companion who spoke his language, a language of growls, chuffs, and instincts carried through generations. The opportunity arrived in the form of Sierra. She was a 2-year-old female grizzly rescued from an illegal roadside attraction in Idaho. Unlike Boone, Sierra had spent her early life around other bears, though always in cramped conditions. When authorities closed the facility, she was relocated to the same conservation center that had overseen Boone's case. Her story was different, but parallel, taken from her wild origins, shaped by human hands, surviving in a world that was never truly hers. When the staff proposed introducing Sierra to Boone, Ethan hesitated. He had seen Boone rejected once before by wild-born cubs, the sting of that memory still fresh. What if it happened again? What if Boone, so used to Ethan's presence, saw Sierra as a threat rather than a companion? But Dr. Hayes insisted they try. "He deserves the chance," she said, "even if it's only a chance." The first meeting was cautious. A mesh barrier separated the two bears, allowing sight and scent without contact. Boone approached slowly, flannel shirt still clenched in his jaw like a talisman. Sierra stayed back, sniffing the air, her eyes sharp and wary. For minutes, they did nothing but watch each other, two orphans of circumstance trying to decide if trust was possible. Then Sierra gave a short chuff, a soft, almost friendly sound. Boone froze, ears forward. After a pause, he chuffed back. It was small, almost imperceptible, but for Ethan it felt monumental. Communication had begun. Over the next week, Boone and Sierra circled each other from opposite sides of the barrier. Sometimes they mirrored movements, pacing the same line as if testing each other's rhythm. Sometimes they pressed noses through the mesh. At night, they often lie close to the barrier, just inches apart. It was a fragile courtship, not of romance, but of possibility. The possibility of connection where none had existed before. Finally, the day came to remove the fence. Staff prepared tranquilizers and escape routes, anticipating conflict. Ethan stood tense, heart racing as the gate swung open. Boone stepped forward first, hesitant but curious. Sierra held her ground. For a moment, the air felt charged like the silence before a storm. Then Sierra chuffed again, low and steady. Boone responded with the same sound. Slowly, they began to circle each other, sniffing, studying, acknowledging. There was no aggression, only curiosity. The hours that followed were tentative. Boone followed Sierra, at a distance mimicking her climbs and digs. Sierra, for her part, tolerated his presence but didn't invite closeness. Yet there was no rejection either, and that alone was victory. By the third day, Ethan walked into the sanctuary to find the two bears playing chasing each other through the creek, splashing wildly, shaking water from their coats like overgrown cubs. Ethan dropped to his knees, overcome with relief. Boone was no longer alone. Connection heals. Boone had survived because of human care, but survival alone isn't enough. Thriving requires relationships even for creatures as solitary as grizzly bears. What Boone and Sierra showed was that companionship doesn't erase scars, but it softens them. Together, they created a space where being different didn't mean being isolated. For Ethan, watching them bond carried a fresh perspective. He realized that love for wildlife isn't only about one-to-one devotion. True care also means stepping back and letting animals find their own bonds, even if that bond doesn't include you. It was bittersweet. Boone no longer ran to him first, dragged the flannel shirt everywhere he went. Instead, he often followed Sierra, learning from her movements, sharing her rhythms. Ethan felt a pang of loss, but also a swell of pride. Boone was growing into himself. Community response deepened the story. Local schools visited again, this time to see Boone and Sierra together. Children asked if they were a family, if they would one day have cubs. Rangers explained that even if that never happened, their companionship was enough. It was a lesson for the children too. Sometimes healing doesn't come from returning to the past, but from building new bonds in the present. There was mystery in their relationship too. No one knew whether Boone's deep imprint on humans would affect his bond with Sierra long term. Would he always turn back to Ethan for reassurance, or would Sierra's presence reshape him? Each day offered hints, but no answers. One evening, as Ethan watched from a distance, Boone and Sierra climbed the same pine tree, perching together on different branches. Boone chuffed softly. Sierra answered, and for a moment they seemed less like misfits and more like what they were always meant to be, bears. The takeaway for viewers is that belonging doesn't have to be solitary. Even animals marked by human influence can find companionship when given the chance. Boone's story reminds us that second chances are not about perfection, they're about possibility. By autumn, Boone and Sierra had carved out routines. They foraged together, played together, and sometimes lay side by side in the grass. Boone still greeted Ethan warmly, but it was different now, less desperate, more balanced. He no longer needed Ethan to be his entire world. He had found a peer, a mirror, a partner in his strangeness. By the time Boone reached his third year, Ethan often found himself standing quietly at the edge of the sanctuary, watching instead of intervening. Boone was no longer the trembling grizzly bear cub that fit into a blanket on the night he was rescued in Glacier National Park. He was now a bear of full muscle, an instinct roaming his acres with the confidence of an animal who knew where he belonged. And yet, every evening when Ethan's truck rolled up the dirt road, Boone still ran to the gate, letting out a chuff that echoed across the trees. One moment in particular stayed with Ethan. It was late autumn. The air was sharp. The creek had thinned to a ribbon of cold water, and Sierra was digging near a cluster of roots. Boone, massive now, carried the red flannel shirt in his jaws and dropped it at Ethan's feet. It was an old ritual, one that had begun when he was a cub, but this time it felt different. Boone didn't linger for comfort. He simply offered the shirt, then turned and lumbered back to Sierra. Ethan picked it up slowly, realizing what it meant. Boone was saying, "I no longer need this the way I once did. But I remember." He taught that survival is not forgetting, but transforming. The shirt, once a lifeline, had become a memory. And memories for both man and bear are bridges between who we were and who we become. What Boone also revealed was the cost of love. Ethan had given up pieces of his own life, money, relationships, sleep plans for the future. To some, it looked like a sacrifice, but to Ethan, it was an investment. Every scratch Boone left on a tree, every playful chase with Sierra, every chuff at the gate was proof that the sacrifice had grown into something larger than himself. In Boone's life, Ethan could see his own reflected messy, unfinished, but meaningful. We often think belonging means choosing one side, wild, or human freedom, or safety instinct, or comfort. Boone showed that sometimes belonging is about creating new ground altogether. A sanctuary where two worlds meet. A space where imperfection is not failure, but truth. The knowledge embedded in his journey matters beyond one bear. Grizzly bears across Montana remain threatened by shrinking habitats, highway collisions, and conflicts with ranchers. Every orphaned cub tells a story about the fragile balance between humans and wild animals. Boone's survival is not just a miracle of love. It is a reminder of what hangs in the balance when we talk about conservation. Behind every statistic is a heartbeat. Behind every endangered species label is an animal searching for a place to live just as Boone did. Hope. In a world where stories about wild animals often end in tragedy, Boone's path showed another possibility. Not perfect, not pure wilderness, but survival with dignity. His bond with Sierra proved that healing is possible even when the past is fractured. His trust in Ethan proved that love can cross species without erasing instinct. And his sanctuary proved that humans can create spaces of coexistence when nature no longer offers them. Ethan often told visitors Boone isn't here to make us feel good. He's here to make us ask questions. Questions like, what do we owe to creatures when our actions shape their fates? How far should compassion go when science advises caution? And most of all, what does it mean to belong when the world no longer has a clear place for you? Those questions don't have easy answers, but Boone's story suggests that answers may not be the point. The point is to keep asking, to keep wondering, to keep trying. That curiosity, the same curiosity that drove Boone to climb his first tree in the sanctuary, can be the spark for change. Boone's life is not just about a grizzly bear cub raised like a human baby. It is about us. It is about the ways we too search for comfort, cling to familiar shirts, and learn to let go when the time comes. It is about the sacrifices we make for what we love and the questions we carry when those sacrifices blur the line between right and necessary. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines, Ethan stood by the creek watching Boone and Sierra splash in the water. Boone paused, glanced back, and made a low chuff. Ethan raised a hand, knowing it was not a call for help anymore. It was an acknowledgement. They were family, not because they shared blood, but because they shared trust. And trust, in the end, is what bridges all worlds. So what does Boone teach us? That survival is not only about claws and teeth, it is also about connection. That belonging is not always given, it is built. And that sometimes the creatures we rescue us in return, reminding us of resilience, compassion, and the fragile miracle of coexistence. Now, I'd like to turn this back to you. Think about your own, Boone, the parts of your life that seemed abandoned or out of place. The bonds that kept you alive when the world felt indifferent, the sacrifices you've made, that shaped who you are today. Boone's story is not just about wildlife rescue. It is about the choices we make to keep love alive even when it asks everything of us. If this journey touched you, if Boone's story helped you reflect on your own, then stay with us. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope still exists. Every story like Boone's brings us closer to protecting the wild animals who cannot tell their stories for themselves.